And so that process within the US has coalesced around different communities and different ideas, and involved a year of open science within the US and I think with global partners. And one of the main pillars of that work was work that was rooted around NIH's data sharing policy. And so, like many funding agencies around the world, the NIH does require a data management plan, which is now a data management and sharing plan. And the policies around that are published to the community. And in 2023, there was an update to those policies that really focused more on the sharing aspects and the auditability of data being shared for NIH-funded research. And around that change that was happening, NIH internally started thinking about how can they incentivize sharing, and what are some of the obstacles, structural obstacles. And so one of the things that really came up in those discussions was this idea that while there are domain-specific repositories that do exist, that can be leveraged and thrive throughout several communities that NIH funds in, there are also some data sets and some software and some outputs that just wouldn't fit into those buckets. And so while the policy was changing to incentivize more data sharing, there really wasn't the same kind of robust data capturing and publishing services for all the data sets that this new policy is covering. And so the idea around GRAY and this idea of generalist repositories ecosystem really came from this idea and workshops that NIH hosted around how do we tackle that problem? How do we tackle as a community that gap that exists where domain repositories and other types of repositories are not able to handle? And so GRAY fits into a very long trajectory and long history within NIH's culture of data sharing. There has been many milestones along the way. I won't go into all of them, of course, but what we really want to showcase with this slide is that GRAY is a piece of a larger puzzle. It's a piece of a larger strategy that exists within NIH and within the US ecosystem and the global ecosystem for data sharing, that really was set up to help with a policy shift at NIH, but also a culture shift within data sharing and open science in general. And so what we within the GRAY teams will talk about here is how are we doing that together? And so the GRAY, what that is, to demystify that jargon term, is GRAY is a NIH-funded project where repositories, like the ones that are represented here, and communities from 7 different generalist repositories, as well as all the different places that those repositories are being leveraged, are funded to come together in a co-opetition model. And that co-opetition model means that there are projects and discussions that happen across these different objectives for each of these repositories to think collectively and work locally within their groups, their product teams, and their outreach teams to achieve together a more robust generalist repository ecosystem. And it's that kind of co-opetition and the power of working together to raise, all ships will rise kind of an approach that we have been working on for the last 3 years and will be continuing to work on. And so what we wanted to do now is really turn the conversation to, in more depth, what is the work of GRAY, so each of you can learn more about the types of projects that we've been working on, the approach that we're taking, and for each of you to kind of learn more about this idea of, where do generalist repositories have that unique value within the larger ecosystem. But before we do that, and before I turn it over to Mark to continue the discussion, we want to just ask everybody here to please jump on Slido. We do, in the first section of the Slido questions, we've been asking, where are you from? What is your background? And that really help us as we're going through and looking at what kind of feedback we're getting from each of you throughout the presentation today and the conversation that we're having. So for the people, because we're doing a hybrid event, there's going to be a little bit of juggling between each section and looking at the Slido results. And so we're going to be trying it out for the first time at the end of this first introduction section. So please bear with us for a second. All right. Not that, yeah, the next one. Yeah, I think that would be, there you go. Perfect. We figured it out. This is, yay! Okay, yeah, so this is the kind of live information that we were hoping to get. So we promise that throughout the presentation, we'll be asking more pertinent questions about generalist repositories, data sharing, ideas around the GRAY initiative. Just to get us started off, we wanted to just capture where are people coming from. We can see, we know it's a very international group, a lot of people from Central and South America, as well as people from Europe and North America and around the world as well represented. So thank you very much for your perspectives. If you at any time are interested in jumping into the Slido, here's the QR code, and then we'll have additional time for us to discuss other insights from the group, both online and in person. Okay, so maybe we can talk a little bit more. Yeah, I think we can move on to the next section because we can capture these informations from others. Yeah, this is great. So people who are repository managers, researchers, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think we want to make sure that we're capturing information from multiple stakeholder groups, really understanding the full, robust ecosystem that exists around data sharing. And so having the ability to capture not only where you're from, who you are, but also what kind of roles that you play at your institutions. Thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and maybe switch over to the next slides and have Mark get started.
Isn't it great when technology all works? Although now I've probably jinxed it. Okay, we're good. So a lot of people were on the Slido. In between the sections, we're going to pull it up and ask you to have a look at it. This section is about generalist repositories and the generalist repository ecosystem initiative. So you are going to be asked more questions, so get back in the Slido and fill in the next segment. We really appreciate the feedback. I think in this session, if we're just talking at you, we can have more of a conversation, but the thing that we will get from this is anonymous, honest opinions on what the community thinks. So add as much context as you can. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate the people online too. So I think what was interesting about the global footprint, right? The NIH is based in the United States and it funds research all over the world. So these policies do infiltrate everywhere. And a lot of the talks we go to in these events, we're saying we wish there was more funding for this. And so I'd like to thank the NIH for this initiative where they are funding generalist repositories to work together. A lot of us who work in the repository space, there's a lot of repository managers in the room. We go to a lot of events, but we often, speaking on behalf of Figshare, we often work in silos. So I knew a lot of the people from the different repositories, but we never actually worked together because what are we going to work together on, right? We're working separately. So it's been really valuable for that. In terms of data repository landscape, I think we may be telling you stuff you already know, but it's always good to make sure that we've got the terms right. In terms of generalist repositories, if the general rule for funders everywhere is if there is a subject-specific repository like GenBank or PDB, make your data available there. It's got high levels of metadata capture. It makes sense. And then we have the institutional repositories that often have somebody to help you, a little bit more curation, but often a lot less metadata. And then we have generalist repositories. And generalist repositories are solving the problem that anybody, anywhere has a place to make their data available, or any of their other types of files. And we're still working between some people put stuff in generalist repositories that should be in subject-specific repositories. So the success of the generalist repositories is really that they are being used by the people who need them. And so you can say, we want to use the generalist repositories less than the subject-specific repositories more, or we need more subject-specific repositories. But what we really want to do is improve the consistency of the generalist repositories and improve the functionality so it's useful for all the different stakeholders whose data it is. So if you didn't know, generalist repositories accept data regardless of the data type, the format, the content, the disciplinary focus, or the methodology. So for the NIH, obviously it's got a good life science skew, but there is a lot of this high tides rise all ships. By improving the interoperability and improving metadata schemas and things like this, it benefits all subject areas and not necessarily just the life sciences. The NIH does have a desirable characteristics of data repositories list. And you may see this if you're an institutional data repository manager and researchers say, it's okay, I've made the data available, they're on my personal website. And you say, that's not perfect, that's not great. Even GitHub, which a lot of people use, is not perfect as a repository. It's not a repository. You can delete the content. It doesn't have DOIs. So the guidance set forth by the NIH and the National Science and Technology Council, as cited in the OSTP guidance, is linked through there. But these are the things that all of the repositories we're talking about today have in common. We have unique persistent identifiers, long-term sustainability, metadata, some level of curation and quality assurance, free and easy access, broad and measured reuse, clear user guidance, security and integrity, confidentiality, common formats, provenance, and retention policies. So this is, when I mentioned before, the repositories weren't necessarily working together. As somebody who worked on Figshare, I'd go and see this list and say, okay, our product team needs to work and make sure that we're building the product so it complies with what the funders are saying. And Mendeley would do the same, Dryad would do the same, Dataverse would do the same. So, but we weren't having conversations about it, so we'd do it slightly differently. There are two primary goals in the mission. One is to establish a common set of cohesive and consistent capabilities, services, metrics, and social infrastructure across generalist repositories. And the second mission is to raise general awareness and help researchers adopt FAIR principles to better share and reuse data. With the generalist repositories, because the metadata is solid and adheres to standard schemas, but it's not as detailed as it might be because we need to be able to have a system that works for humanities research as much as genetics or other sciences. There's sometimes a pushback on the term fair. Well, I see some stuff that's made available that isn't fair. And I always think that the repositories are built following those desirable characteristics that means that if you make your data available there, it can be fair. And so the thing that you need to do is describe it well and make sure the metadata is good. And then it's fair because these repositories have APIs, make it so that the data does propagate into other systems. So not all data in generalist repositories is fair, but all data that's put in generalist repositories has the capability to become fair. And so that's what we want to encourage. So we want to make it easier for researchers to share data. We want to enable the improved discoverability of NIH-funded data across generalist repositories. And as I mentioned at the beginning, by being funded by the NIH, it's a fantastic thing for the generalist repositories, but it's also, they get something too. If they're paying for it, they get to call a few of the shots, right? And so making sure that they can find out about all of the NIH-funded research across all of the repositories is one of the goals. But by doing that, if you work for a funder, you'll probably be able to do it for your funder too. So it works well. We want to support greater reproducibility of NIH-funded research data by ensuring data associated with publications is readily available. Again, playing back to the NIH policies. The NIH policy says at the time you publish your paper, you have to make your data available. So that's related to that. Avoid duplication of data across repositories. We don't want 15 of the same data set in 15 different generalist repositories. Encourage NIH-funded researchers to be both contributors and consumers to increase the reuse of data. This is a hard one, right? I think a lot of people see the benefits of having data available so that researchers can build on top of what's gone before, or the AIs can go build on top of what's gone before. But I think it's still a new area. You might go out and read papers from different journals, but I don't think many people do a data search just yet to see, has this experiment already been done before they start doing their research? And so that's something we want to encourage. So, all of the documentation for all of our stuff, we've got lots of stuff that's available on Zenodo, can be found at that link and that QR code. So if you want to find out more, everything is done transparently. All the code that's worked on to do this is made openly available. So it's all done in a very transparent way. And as this slide showed before, some of the things we're looking at: adopting consistent metadata models, cataloging use cases supported. So again, if you work at an institutional repository, there's lots of use cases that you can use. There's lots of materials that are out there that can help support you in your work. Implementing open metrics, so we have consistent way to measure impact across all of these repositories. Training materials, conduct outreach, what we're doing right now, and commit to co-opetition. Co-opetition was a new word to me. This is what it means. So as I say, we all work for different repositories, and we all have different goals, different setups, different reasons for existing. And co-opetition is cooperation and competition. So we all want to do the space to do well, but personally, I also want to make sure that the people working on Figshare are kept in a job. And so we we have this value line. Underneath it is stuff that we are doing together: cooperate on common features and standards, metadata, persistent identifiers, metrics, discovery, privacy. So, can we all agree that we're going to use RAWs? Yes, let's do that, move that forward. And then we compete on unique features across the group. So the similarities: fair data sharing across disciplines, strive to adhere to repository best practices, and leverage community standards such as data site metadata and persistent identifiers like ORCID and RAW. Yeah, again, speaking on behalf of Figshare, we knew we were going to work with RAW, but is it the top of the priority list? Maybe not. We all agree we're going to commit to it in the next year. Everybody does it. Now every repository has RAW. Great. And then there's distinct attributes. So we have a mixture of nonprofit, academic, and commercial organizations. Some are open source, some are not open source. And we offer, but all of the code that is produced from Gray funding is made open source. And we offer varying features such as data visualization, file types and sizes, curation, licenses, and controlled access. So although we are all generalist repositories, you might have a favorite, you might have one that works better for your subject, things like this. Slido results. Did you fill in the Slido? We'll find out right now. And you will be about to be prompted for the next set of questions. So get the tab open ready, so we can get some feedback. Oh, okay. Did we miss a section? We've captured all that great feedback. We're internalizing it, and we'll report back on it at a later date. But we appreciate your contributions. It skipped over it for you too? We might come back to that at the end, depending on time, but right now we're moving on to the data site shared foundational infrastructure. So do fill in your Slido for this if you haven't already.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Yeah, that is a slide, yeah.
your Slido's open for inputs.
Okay.
This is your
Yeah,
question.
it's already.
Yeah, it's already running.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'll go back a bit. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Lakshmi. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Sarala. So I am here today to talk about how DataSite provides the needed infrastructure and support to achieve GRACE goals and objectives. So I'll speak a little bit about DataSite first. I'm sure many of you here are already aware. DataSite was formed in 2009. We're actually celebrating our 15th anniversary this year. So if you want to join us in our open house to celebrate, yeah, join us there. So we were formed by the research community, for the research community, to ensure that the research outputs are openly available and connected. So we work with over 1,500 organizations right now across like 57 different countries. So it has grown a lot over the past 15 years. So if you want to find out more about DataSite and become a member, if you're not, we have Gabby, our membership lead, here as well. So please come and talk to us. In terms of how to the relationship with Gray repositories actually have been part of our DataSite member community for many years. Gray was formed in 2022, but really Zenodo, I think, joined in 2013. So, and also NIH is also a member. So we really work with this community, and we have been for a long time, and we work on community efforts as well as providing like infrastructure solutions. So that's where we kind of fit in. So DataSite provide open infrastructure that supports research community to connect and share knowledge. So what does this really mean? So we provide services to create DOIs, so register DOIs and their associated metadata. And we also provide services around finding more insights about the data that we have in our metadata store. And we also provide services around tracking the impact of the research output that everyone generates. Right now, we have about 72 million DOIs registered at DataSite. In terms of sort of specific areas that we really are involved with Gray to support, so Gray repositories all register DOIs and their metadata with us, and we also provide a sort of a DataSite schema aligns all the sort of different metadata that the repositories provide. So that's one area. And the last area is really the data matrix. So in collaboration with the Make Data Count initiative, we work on open metrics and also providing services around that. So I'll speak a little bit more about these and with some statistics as well. So all the Gray repositories use our APIs so that it's integrated into their own workflows to register DOIs scalably. And we have about 14.5 million DOIs registered across Gray repositories, and that's about 20%. So that's quite a lot coming from the Gray repositories. The initiative also focuses a bit around data sets. So I did add a graph around the data set numbers. So we have around 3.4 million data set DOIs stored in DataSite. In terms of the metadata, so we have a DataSite metadata schema, which allows all the Gray repository to register their metadata in a consistent way. And we also provide ways to link to other PIDs. So you can link to other DOIs for publications, ORCIDs for people, RAW for organizations. So we collect all that information as part of the metadata schema when you register a DOI. So then DataCite ends up having a huge sort of network of all this information that we can sort of explore and navigate. In terms of the resource types, I actually added a graph here which shows like we have about 30 different resource types, and I think Gray repositories really cover the whole range of different resource types. Yeah, so that's around that. And in terms of data matrix, so since we have all this information and connected information, we can provide services around this number of citations or even getting the citations and the references. So we provide services that people can use. And we also have a service called Usage Tracker, where the repositories can embed it on the DOI landing pages, and we can track downloads and views consistently across these repositories. We are also funded by Wellcome Trust to build a sort of a citation corpus. The idea there is get citations from more than one resource, so not just what we have at DataCite, but also from other third-party places. So at the moment, we have in the citations from papers to accession numbers, which is generated by CZI using an algorithm. So that's something that's ongoing work. We are just exploring where things can go from there. In terms of the downstream things that you can use, so once you have all this information at DataCite, we provide sort of interfaces to interact with this information. So this is our sort of front end, DataCite Commons. You can go and look at DOI Insights. So this is like an example from Dryad. It shows all the connections, some metadata. It's not quite clear, but anyway, it shows all the number of views and downloads, etc. So this is a good way to explore information. And the one on the right, repository insights page, also sort of shows you the aggregated information that we have at DataCite. One of the great things about having everything in one place, we can also disseminate it easily. So we have APIs that aggregators, the third-party aggregators, can come and get the information. So there's the API or as a file download. So for example, OpenAlex or OpenAir can access this information. So we do try to get this information out there through these mechanisms. Yeah, so that's there. Continuing on. Oh yes, so the relationship, the working relationship, Gray is obviously ongoing. So we will be working with the Gray repositories on sort of a few things I've listed here, tracking NIH-funded research data, as this is funded by NIH, and also improvements to data metrics services as well. Yeah, so this is it from me. Thank you very much. I wouldn't press anything. Or do we have a Slido?
We do have a Slido, and I logged in on my laptop and on my phone so we can see kind of what other people are seeing. And yeah, Flexme, if you want to show the results in between each section, maybe what we can do is just talk through some of the insights that we're getting from people. From Sarala's discussion, what we really wanted to focus on was the idea that, gray repositories are important for the data sharing practices across all research, including NIH research. And many of those that are many of those repositories and other repositories are leveraging common infrastructure. A key piece of that infrastructure is DataCite. And so one of the things that we've learned along the way within the GRAY project is that for us to collectively work together in the way that Mark was mentioning, it's really important for us to not just work directly together, but also work through the communities that we have. So one of them, of course, is RDA. That's why we're here, but also DataCite as a community organization that offers that infrastructure is really key. So in the Slido, one of the things that we really wanted to capture was just how many of you here are DataCite members? Are you familiar with that infrastructure that Sarala was going through? And then also really think about how some of the key infrastructure and key systems that we are leveraging within the GRAY project from DataCite can be leveraged or is potentially could be leveraged by your teams or by your repositories. So I think that one of the things that we want to do with the Slido is to capture information from each of you around what you're thinking, what your thoughts are. And when we go into this next section, we're actually going to talk about specific projects that we have been tackling, both with DataCite and together. So as I was showing in the introduction slides, and as Mark was mentioning, there is a set of objectives that GRAY has put together. NIH, the foundation of the initiative, comes with those objectives. And so we're going to be walking through those objectives and talking a little bit more about how some of the work we've been doing and the projects we've been working on within GRAY fit against those objectives and how they fit into the co-opetition model that we are leveraging with GRAY.
It's really interesting as well to see the results coming in here and seeing, as John mentioned, having DataCite as a central aggregator of all of the content makes it very easy because, instead of us having to build separately designed dashboards for consumption, you can just go to DataCite. And if we all agree to play by the same rules, it'll capture everything there. So it's really interesting to see the feedback here on how can generalist repositories help to set global standards for data sharing and reuse beyond implementing DataCite, metadata schema, and using other DataCite tools. So there's a lot of talk about curation. And there's a good example, right? If we all start to do curation of data sets, which I'm not saying we are going to do, but then identifying which data sets have been curated, for example, we could say, okay, DataCite is going to capture the information on whether this is being curated, yes or no, and then you'll be able to filter based on DataCite as opposed to doing it ourselves. Deal with spam and copyright issues. Yep, that's the thing that we always have to work on. And again, we can share our stories between the group. Yeah, quality check, more quality checks. From a publisher perspective, it would be useful to see a system that combines the strengths of both generalist and domain-specific repositories while overcoming the shortcomings of both. E.g., integrations like generalist repositories have with our systems, but can also direct to domain-specific where needed. And there was a mention there of re3 data as well, and helping researchers understand what data repositories are available to them, which ones they should use, and having that conversation with publishers as well is obviously part of the bigger ecosystem. We're never going to run out of things to do. Yeah, we're just getting a to-do list.
Yeah. So speaking of things to do, we're going to move on to the next section. And in that section, we're opening up questions that are going to be about a series of projects that I'll be going through. So we really do want your feedback on the projects, but please don't answer the questions before we kind of start discussing the topic. When we put together this Slido, we have about 6 different areas we're going to talk about of project work we've done, and we want to get input from those, or on those different areas. So just kind of following along the narrative of where we are in the presentation, and just kind of answering the questions as we go would be very helpful. Okay, hold on one second. Let me grab my. Yes, okay, I see it. So you'll see the Slido has been opened. If you haven't joined the Slido, that is the QR code. Again, the join code is 1421386. And we'll go ahead and get started. And in this section, really what we want to do is talk again about those objectives and the work that we're doing within the co-opetition.
I'm sorry, I know I'm not being recorded. Can we start filling in, or are we forbidden to do that?
There's nobody forbidden to do anything. Everybody, there is freedom amongst all of us. We're just that the questions that exist within the Slido right now are directly related to the slides. So as I talk about the slides, you'll kind of see this first one. The first question there is about metadata. So you'll see that that makes sense to answer as I'm talking about metadata. We'll be moving on to use cases, and when we talk about use cases, there's a question in there about use cases. So just kind of answering them as we're discussing them would probably give you more context. That's all. So thumbs up. We have other comments and our questions before we get started? Okay. Okay, so as we've mentioned, the GRAY initiative is a co-opetition amongst 7 generalist repositories. We are collectively working together on projects to make all of the repositories and the wider ecosystem better for data sharing. So what are some of the things, what are some of the tangible things that we have done that have come out of this kind of work? So that is what we're going to talk about now. So instead of talking theoretically about how we work together, the ways we're working, instead of talking about kind of the way we're leveraging DataCite and communities, we're now going to talk about project work. So the first thing we wanted to talk about is metadata. So as we all know, metadata is very important not only for capturing and describing the information, the data or the files that we are preserving within repositories. It's also very important for reuse. It's important for understanding the science that is in those files. We are looking at ways for metadata to help with not only fair, but also machine actionability of the information within our repositories. And so these types of issues that exist around metadata are very important to all the work that we do. I mean, and not just within GRAY, but in all the facets of RDA's work. And so one of the things that we've been focusing on within GRAY is really understanding what are the important pieces of metadata that generalist repositories can focus on, and how can we normalize those practices across the repositories and use that normalization as a place, as a platform for us to discuss best practices for other repositories. And so one of the things that we focused on within the objectives around adopting consistent metadata models and connecting digital objects is not just is how we can leverage DataCite and metadata communities of practice for consistent common vocabularies for different metadata fields, but also really thinking about metadata as something that is living and iterative, and how we can talk about repositories being exemplars, not just in the information they put within metadata files, but also in the way that they update and manage metadata files. And so this is also a big piece of metadata, not thinking of it as a snapshot, but also thinking of it as an iterative, ongoing practice. And we also want to make sure that we think of metadata and is not just something that is published to a JSON file or to a database that is behind the repository, but also something that is broadcast. And so leveraging communities like DataCite to broadcast out metadata and understanding how we can leverage those communities for, as Mark was mentioning, interactions like dashboards and these types of things that happen when you can consistently broadcast out metadata. And so that is something that we have been spending a lot of time on. We have built a recommendation document for how we have implemented our versions of the DataCite metadata schema 4.4. We have each of our 7 repositories have been working to implement that recommendation, not only on future data sets and files that are published in the repositories, but also the back file of information that has already been published. So we can really think of consistency as something that is for the entire corpus of information. And really thinking about how do we think of how we can work together on connecting digital objects. And so metadata is not just about declaring, what is the funder, what is the researcher's ORCID, what is the, the affiliation ROR. It's also about what are the connections. And so as Sarala was mentioning, things like data citation, how do we create that connection between a data file, a data thing, and its associated outputs like papers or preprints. We really want to think about those connections and how do we connect those through the metadata. And so this recommendation document is actually available up on the Zenodo community. We showed the QR code for that earlier. There is if you just go to Zenodo and search for Gray within the community search, you'll find us. All of our outputs are there. And this recommendation document is something that we would welcome anybody to take a look at and think about how it applies to your repository work. One specific thing that we have done within the metadata work is our work with ROR. So for those that are not familiar with this, ROR is the Research Organization Registry. It's a community effort to build a controlled vocabulary registry of identifiers for all research institutions in the world. So any group, any organization that's doing research that potentially could be like an affiliation for a researcher, is cataloged within a registry within ROR, and that registry is cleaned and centrally curated within a core team, and is something that all of us in the world, every single one of us, can leverage for free, and we can start to build connections through clean institution information using ROR. And so the repositories at Gray have really thought of ROR as something that we can leverage in our work, and within the metadata work has become very core to not just thinking about how we can make cleaner metadata, but also how can we interact with institutions better. And ROR is not just research institutions like universities, it's also research institutions like those that fund research, like the NIH or others. And so there are RORs for funding agencies as well. And so how can we use ROR for declaring clean information around funding and clean information around affiliations for researchers? And that kind of work of creating better, cleaner metadata around those two element metadata fields has been core to some of the work we've done in the last couple of years within Gray. If you think about the implications of that, having clean information from a generalist repository where there's just varying types of data files and varying types of information, and being able to discover what is from your institution, or having a clear understanding of where the researchers who create it are from, that can be very different. And when we talk about Gray, we are talking about those 7 repositories, but we're also talking about all the different institutions and groups that are using and leveraging those platforms as their backend, right? So there are many institutions that are using Dataverse or using Figshare or using Dryad or using Zenodo as something that they could leverage for their institutional repository. And so you have this kind of broad connection of implementation that can be affected through adoption within the Gray community. So there was a Slido question in there around metadata. So if you have questions or ideas, we'll kind of come back to them at the end of this section. But we're going to move on to another set of work. Now there is a Slido question there about use cases. So what we've been doing within this objective within Gray is thinking about articulating and publishing out what are common and useful use cases for people to use Gray repositories. I think that one of the main kind of overarching goals of Gray has been to demystify generalist repositories and to offer some ways of validating the type of science that can be put into generalist repositories through the action of making these repositories better, right? We don't want to be thought of, if we're going to ask researchers to put things and share data as often as possible, and we know there isn't a domain repository for everything, we don't want to be in a situation where researchers feel that putting their research into a space is less than. And so we really want to make sure that as a community, we are building good practices. And the best way for us to do that is to actually clearly articulate what are the use cases where that is important, what are use cases that are common across generalist repositories that can offer ways for people to understand how and when it's appropriate to put something in a generalist repository. And so a piece of our work has been to articulate these use cases. Again, they are up on our Zenodo community. The link is there. We put up the QR code earlier, but if you just go to Zenodo and you type in Gray, you'll find the Gray community. We have use cases documentation for many different types of usages for generalist repositories. This is, no worries. We're using a personal laptop, which sometimes things pop up. We have different use cases that articulated, and one of the things that we want to make sure is that, like everything that we do at Gray, it's something that we want to be able to be adopted or reused by others. So many of these use cases are things that maybe your institutional repository or your administration or your researchers may want to leverage for understanding use cases for Gray adoption or generalist repository adoption. So we do welcome people grabbing these, reusing them, rethinking them for their own contexts. And so some of them are listed here, but we thought instead of going through all of them, we would instead of going through all of them, we would just focus on a couple of the ones that kind of illustrate the work that we've been doing. So this is a use case that is, as an NIH-funded researcher, which is a very core audience to the work of Gray, I want to select a repository to share my data so that I can comply with my data management and sharing plan and the conditions of my grant. So this use case really touches not only on the work of Gray and the work that is important to NIH, but also speaks to works that's very near and dear to the hearts of RDA members around how do we help guide researchers through the complexity of choosing a repository, how do we guide people through the compliance aspects from grants and funding, and how do we incentivize best practices for data sharing and data management. So all of these different elements are wrapped up in this use case. So as you read through some of the documentation that we have presented through, that's up on Zenodo, you'll see that aspects of what we're doing within Gray help with this type of a use case, and this is where we can start to effectively articulate why generalist repositories would be helpful to NIH researchers, how the usage of Gray repositories and generalist repositories can be leveraged and connected to other work, how we can incorporate best practices and incorporate not just from us as Gray repositories, but also with the best practices that are articulated by funders and by institutions, how all of that can be interconnected. And so here's an example of how we can kind of illustrate some of the aspects of that use case in practical terms. We don't want to just talk about use cases as theoretical ideas for academics and for UX designers. We also want to think about it as actual features and articulation of value to the community. So thinking of the ease of use for NIH researchers, the ability to upload, but also the ability to manage and restrict when needed, the ability to assign those kind of brokerage features, the ability to add elements and metadata information as needed. These types of things start to map onto those use cases. Another use case, just to kind of dive into another one, is as an institution, I use a generalist repository infrastructure for my institutional data repository. So I was just mentioning this earlier. I mean, the 7 repositories that are gray, they are not just individual domains, they are also infrastructure for many institutional repositories. So we're not just implementing changes in 7 small little projects, we're really creating a network effect across an entire community by the work that we're doing. And
there's repositories that, institutional repositories that don't use this infrastructure, but because we're putting everything out there in the use cases, we can say you don't have to be a part of the actual group that's working on this right now, but you can follow our guides, and if you subscribe to them.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that, you know, going back to the way that we're publishing out and asking for the community to jump in and reuse and remix the outputs that we're creating, you know, the goal is not just for this work to be something that is done within our product teams, but really something that can help influence the best practices and the implementation across product teams and technical and social change within other institutional repositories. And I think that you know, the institutional needs, many of us here in RDA, we represent institutions that have this kind of institutional need. The need for repositories that meet many of those best practices, the desirable characteristics that we put up there from NIH, other desirable characteristic lists and communities exist. We have that kind of core need within our community to find ways to offer that value to researchers. And so thinking about how to create trust within the community, how to offer the right features so that there's validity to the work that we're doing that is apparent, transparent, and that we are consistent in the way that we are working with researchers and with institutions so that there is that credibility that gets built. And so, as we were mentioning, here's examples of generalist repositories that are being leveraged by institutions. We also know that there are many generalist repositories that, you know, people are using just through their interface themselves, but they also, you know, in some cases are through customized institutional interfaces. We also know that many of you run your own generalist or institutional repository that is not, as Mark was saying, is not based on the backbone of these kind of platforms, but could leverage many of the use cases and information that we're sharing. So that's kind of the description of the work that we've done, just a glimpse into that work that we've done within use cases. So within Slido, there was a question in there about what are some of the other use cases you could think of, and we can go through that at the end of this section. We wanted to also talk about metrics. One of our objectives is around implementing open metrics. Sarala mentioned this. We really think of DataCite as a core piece of this system that we are trying to work through. But there are other ways that we are, as a gray community, trying to tackle this issue. And it is really tied into this idea of connecting digital objects. So back to that metadata question that I was bringing up earlier. So for us, supporting common approaches to data metrics is really about focusing on not just sharing stats, but also rationalizing and normalizing that information. So what are the best practices in the community? How do we spark conversations with stakeholders in implementation, but also in just coming up with the best approaches for how to do this? And how do we, you know, work on a common goal, which is, you know, we're trying to build context around data. We're trying to build information that can offer a glimpse into how people are using or citing or reusing the information in our repositories. And so, kind of jumping into some of the work that we're doing, Sarala did mention, we have been leveraging community groups. Some of you are involved, RDA's been very involved through community working groups about, with a project called Make Data Count. Make Data Count has hosted some birds of a feather and interest group, a working group efforts through RDA around creating data usage stats. Gray and the Gray repositories have been working through and with the Make Data Count project as well, which for those that are not familiar, it's a very open, all of you are welcome to join and get involved, community of people thinking about how the future of data metrics can be done in a meaningful, responsible way. where we have a transparent, auditable trail of information. And so what we've been doing with the Gray work with Make Data Count is really looking at their guidance on how to handle data usage stats, data citation stats, working through with them and through DataCite as well on how to bring those and represent those statistics within repositories and make them meaningful for users and researchers when they see those on websites. And so what we've done is created a set of best practices. Again, up on the Zenodo community, you can download and see the ways that the Gray repositories are leveraging Make Data Count inspired statistics, leveraging the work that DataCite has done into usage trackers, implementations, so finding ways of creating rationalized data usage stats. And then also thinking about ways that we can leverage and publish out data citations. So how do we find connections between data and papers that exist either in the paper metadata and the data repository metadata or both? So finding a way of representing those within the repositories. And that is a recommendation document that's up on Zenodo, and as we've mentioned, it's something that you can read so you can learn more about our work, but it's also something you can read so that you can learn about, for your repository work as well.
Yes.
So there's a question in there that was about open metrics on the Slido, so please fill that out, and then we'll move on to the community engagement. So we know that this is kind of a large section within the program where we're going through a lot of the project work that we're doing. We want to just make sure people here understand the tangible project work that Gray's doing so you can see how it could affect your work as well. And really the last section what we have is around this idea of community engagement, which, I mean, this project, this Birds of a Feather is part of that. Getting out there in the community, making sure that we have the opportunity to discuss what Gray is trying to do, trying to discuss what the model is, the fact that these kind of what could be perceived as competitors can actually work together on common practice. Also look at the ways that we can fill gaps within the ecosystem. So the idea, the inspiration of this project is that there have been perceived gaps of where data could go. So instead of complaining about it, let's actually just dig in there and actually make it better and fill those gaps. And so these kinds of values and this kind of work that we're doing, we want to make sure we get out to not only researchers, but also the people who support researchers, because it's important for them to use this information when they interact with researchers. So we want to create that, again, that network effect of creating connections and conversations. And so we have been doing a series of webinars and coming to conferences, talking about Gray, not only about the general idea of co-opetition, but again, on some of those outputs, really circulating how they can be used and reused, and offering those as training materials for communities to leverage. And so within that, our priority audiences are data librarians, of course, researchers, scientific research communities, so professional societies, really thinking about how we can not just work individually, one-on-one, but how can we work at scale?
I put that
right?
wrong. I'm so sorry.
Even with the resources of these 7 organizations, we still would never be able to influence and engage with the community effectively if we really went out one by one and knocked on doors of labs. What we have to do is find ways of communicating at scale in places like RDA and others.
Okay.
But we also want to think about, where do we influence the community? So working with publishers and journals so they understand, you have a data policy, you want to offer options for that data policy within your journal. How do you interact with generalist repositories, and when is it appropriate to send them to a domain repository versus a generalist repository? Offering that kind of information and just general information with domain-specific, discipline-specific repositories, academic institutions. Often we can talk to data librarians and think that that is where we should be focusing our time, which is very important. It is our priority audience, but there's other areas within academic institutions that require some interaction. Specifically when it comes to things like the grants office or the Office of Research or Research IT. And so thinking about how we can engage with those communities as well. And so that is done through our blog. We have a blog that we publish to regularly. The Zenodo community, we've mentioned it several times. There is a community of all the outputs and documents that we've created, links to webinar recordings, and really creating a resource center there. And also through social media and the Office of Data Science Strategy at NIH's channels and disseminating the outputs through there. We also been doing in-person and virtual training opportunities, doing them directly from Gray repositories and also partnering with the Carpentries on how to influence the ways that they've been doing training around the world and leveraging Gray repositories and the recommendations from Gray within the Carpentries training courses. We also have been doing webinars and workshops, again, with those target audience that I mentioned before. And also we want to make sure that the information that we're giving, as we've mentioned, is something that can be leveraged not just for the promotion of these 7 repositories, but also can be leveraged by any repository working on any platform to really understand how we can make sure all ships are rising. And so the way that we do that and the way that one of the reasons why we do that is really to gather feedback. So we have a structure for how we create work packages that we're working on collectively. And one of the ways that we create those, that roadmap is through gathering feedback like we are today with each of you. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the planning opportunities we have for future work, and Lakshmi will walk us through kind of what we're planning on doing in year 4 and getting your feedback on that. But yeah, this is one of the reasons why we really want to make sure we do these community engagement activities, is because we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to get feedback from the community. And so just a couple other things, just kind of move through. I know that there are other questions in the Slido. We have, as part of our work, done a generalist repository comparison chart. It's very much been affected by work that's been done at RDA and through others here at RDA and in the room. We have gone through a couple iterations on this within the Gray team, and one of the main things that's been of value here is that we've started to really dive into normalizing the answers on each of them so that it's, instead of being varying degrees of information within the comparison chart, it's something that we can start to normalize together and make sure that we're conveying similar information in each of the areas across these different repositories. And so that is something that we leveraged RDA's common descriptions attributes and so we thank the RDA community for creating those and allowing us to leverage those when we are updating this comparison chart. And then also taking that comparison chart and creating it into a workflow. So we have spent a considerable amount of time going through each of those comparison chart attributes and thinking about how do you turn that into something that would actually help with determining where someone could publish their data. Where do we create the connections and nuances to respect the nuances of when a researcher has that need of publishing a data? What are the different steps and where does it make sense for them to go to get information? And so again, up on the Zenodo community, you'll learn more about the flowchart that we have created and the way that it could be potentially helpful to you as you're interacting with researchers or when you're working in your repositories as well. So we just wanted to kind of end on that kind of comparison chart and flowchart aspect so that we could discuss how RDA has been very formative in some of the work that we're doing and how it can help with the interactions with researchers. So that was a lot. You listened to me talk for quite a bit. Hopefully it made sense when I started and I said, please wait for the slides when you're doing the Slido questions. And so what we wanted to do is just kind of get some of the feedback from you around what are some of the responses to some of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, there's some really good stuff in there. Metadata is important. Who knew? There's also, yeah, some good stuff in there about option to export in different formats. And this is great because it is genuinely stuff that we take on board. Schema.org, we're all over it.
Yeah, I think one thing here that we might get into later is that options of exporting in different formats. I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot within RDA and in the gray working groups is the idea that while there are so many different types of data, there's also the need for us to have common packaging formats and common ways to retrieve data files, because very, very rarely are we just researchers or any of us going and finding one and then wanting to go through and create some sort of discover the meaning along the way. We really want that to be self-described in a data package format. And so that's something that we want to make sure we explore as an option.
Yeah, are there any other questions we had answered here? Yeah. Additional metadata. Yeah, temporal. Yeah, and this is where, how do we move from generalist repositories getting more subject-specific metadata without stepping on the toes of the subject-specific repositories? Any more questions in this section?
Yeah, quite a few.
Cognizant of time.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so I think it's important if if you haven't filled this out or if you're still joining us, please jump in and offer some feedback. And what we'll do now is maybe we'll switch over to talking about the
broader impact.
Broader impact.
And I'm gonna whiz through this section in the interest of time. The Slido is away. Everybody fill in your Slido for the next section. It's nice that you can hear the translator being as enthusiastic as well. Thank you. So, as I say, I'm going to speed through this section because we talked a bit about the broader implications, and we want to hear from Lakshmi, and we're running short on time. And if you do have any questions or any comments, we might have time for them at the end, so get them ready. But I will preempt that by saying we've thought about this. This is kind of the end point of why we're doing this, is there is consensus. I don't know how we could have achieved this otherwise in terms of getting everybody on the same page. And we saw that data citation recommendations for repositories document. I was the co-chair on that working group, and I would have liked for it to have moved faster. And we'd be coming out now and saying, this is how you count citations. That was my aim. But there's that old phrase of, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so we're in the process of going far and getting consensus on things before Mark runs away and does this thing on his own, right? So when groups come along, we can say, we've thought about this. This is the hours we've put into it. And it's very much like RDA, right? If people come to you and say, why should I use this standard? Or who says you're the arbiter of what makes good sense in this space? We just lost the Zoom, but we might come back. Then it's because, well, we've had a working group on it. And if you want to join the working group, come along to the working group. And if you want to get something into generalist repositories as a system or a feature, if you want to have raids come in, then whoa. Back to the sloth. Then we've thought about it, right? And we have consensus. And if you're just one person who says, I think this is the most important thing that generalist repositories should be doing, in the words of the Big Lebowski, that's just your opinion, man. And if everybody buys into it and everybody says that is the most important next thing we should be working on, then we get consensus and we move forward. And so with some of the things that we've been doing, the broader impact, it feels weird to say this. I don't know how the other repositories feel about this, but I feel like the subject-specific repositories are elite, not in a bad way elite, but just elite. And so we can help the subject-specific repositories by saying, this is what we have consensus on the boring stuff, on the interoperability. So you can, thanks so much, Lakshmi. Yeah. So you can they can take some stuff from what we're doing. Because again, I think the subject-specific repositories are even more siloed, right? I think we want to get to a point where you have broad science working interdisciplinary, but I don't know if different, the physics folks are talking to the genomics folks. And so we can help bridge that gap in this lovely forest of repositories. And again, it works for institutional repositories too. What we were saying before about if you don't have a repository that's built by one of these platforms, you can see what the basics are, because that team might be an open source project that doesn't have hundreds of hours to think about this in group meetings in Chicago that we had recently. Common repository standards for metadata, persistent identifiers, ontologies, metrics. These are the things we're talking about. The implications in terms of enhanced generalist repository functionality for data sharing and discovery use cases. So Gray repositories have agreed to implement Google-style search and browse, and so getting common filters when we talk about how you filter through the content, common metadata fields that we've agreed to implement. Half of us so far have implemented Make Data Count. We're all going to do it. We've all committed to that. And almost all Gray repositories collect and submit relational metadata to data sites. So we get the consensus, we agree we're going to do it. You have some flexibility on the priorities, but we can advise to the bigger community that these things are the way to go. Yeah, there's some repetition here, so I'm just gonna jump on through. Ishwar can't be here, but we do have a quote from him, which would have been awkward if he was sat on the couch and I was quoting him. But the NIH believes that the collective efforts of the Gray repository teams will help bring about the culture change required to share research data. And that's really what we're looking to do, is support a culture of data management and sharing that treats data sharing as a standard scientific practice that is valued and rewarded. So it's just that idea of just repeatedly hammering people over the head with this idea until it becomes part of their general practices. So there's some Slido results there, but yeah, do we just want to move on to Lakshmi and then talk about what's coming next, which is the fun stuff? And you can argue and say, I wouldn't do that. I think you should work on this.
In just a minute, I'll open the Slido for this section.
I can do it. I'll just do it right now.
Yeah. All right, like Mark said, exciting stuff. So looking forward to year 4. Before we go into year 4, I wanted to talk about how some of the accomplishments that John talked about, how did we reach there? How did we plan all of that? So each year, now we are in the 3rd year of Gray project. Each year, all the repositories come together and develop an annual competition plan, which has got a consistent list of collaborative tasks and deliverables. And all the repositories contribute towards the development of this plan. We vote to approve the final plan, and then all the individual repositories go back, and then they work on their individual project plan as well. Yeah. Oh. Sorry. Okay. So the program year in Gray runs from March to February. So year 4 will start in March 2025, and right now we are seeking feedback. While we are working on our year 4 plan, we are also seeking feedback from the community to help us further refine the work for that. So the next few slides that I'm showing will have some of our tentatively planned tasks and deliverables for year 4, and we invite your feedback using Slido, or as we go along, I'll show you the other ways of giving the feedback. So consistent metadata. So the plan is to have the tasks are to support consistent funder metadata, implement fair signposting in these repositories, and explore automation or potential use of AI for improving the quality of the existing as well as the new metadata. In terms of search and browse as an objective, the task that we are focusing here is to evaluate controlled vocabularies to determine recommended standards to support cross-repository search. I'm just jumping through terms of time. So connecting digital objects, we are evaluating and agreeing on recommended data packaging standards for implementation in these repositories, and assess the potential for an implementation of authenticated ORCIDs for authors and co-authors, and identify any gaps and data site related identifier schema, and make any improvements to make it more user-friendly. And then in terms of quality control, I saw that we have had feedback related to spam detection and removal. So that is also something that we are considering for year 4. I remember when we were having discussions in Chicago in September, this was one of the topics that consistently came up in all of the repositories. Also, we are planning to define quality curation in generalist repository context. So while you are filling the questions in Slido on what you want to see in our year 4 plan, there are other ways to provide us with feedback. So this year, we have decided to put all of our stuff into GitHub repository. So you can explore our year 3 plan in detail. So since we started in year 3, all the year 3 stuff, all the ongoing tasks and all the deliverables, the status of all of that is there in GitHub. You can scan the code, you'll end up in GitHub. And you'll also find the outlines of work that we have completed for year 1 and year 2. And as we are developing the plans for year 4, we invite your feedback in there as well on our GitHub discussion board. Yeah, so basically, share your feedback on discussion thread for year 4 plans. We will also be putting together a ranking poll. Once we finalize the year 4 task, we will be sharing a ranking poll for you to kind of prioritize what do you want to see in year 4. So this will be coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned for that. Yeah, generalist repository interest group. This is something that was added in the last minute. But yeah, the primary mission here is to establish a common set of cohesive and consistent capabilities, services, metrics, and social infrastructure. So basically, bringing together active generalist data repositories to provide a forum for sharing practical experience and knowledge, and developing joint projects and represent interest of the generalist repositories in other interest groups and working groups. These are the further ways to stay connected with Gray. You can join the mailing list. You have the Gray blogs, GitHub discussion board that just showed, and also you can view all of our published deliverables in Zenodo. That is that. Do you want to discuss the questions?
Well, just the first one at least. Yeah, if you want to go to the results. So I think, I mean, one, you'll see through the presentation of year 4 that, you know, we are going through a plan right now for determining what the scope will be for year 4, which starts in March of next year. There's also work that's going on right now that you can interact with. As Lakshmi was saying, like if you go into the GitHub, you can interact with the work packages that are currently being worked on. And if you want to look at some of the outputs, some of the work that we've done, you can definitely go up to the Zenodo community, read the blog, or join the mailing list as well. So we could, you know, what we were hoping to get was just, you know, what are some of the ideas that we have for year 4? What are the ones that seem the most relevant to the work here? And looks like standardized controlled vocabularies across the different generalist repositories is number one. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because we are generalist repositories, so having that standardized metadata is very important. Also seeing AI and machine learning and making sure the data there is available and improved so that it can, automation is something that's possible. And data packaging formats, which is something we were talking about earlier about consistent ways of consuming the data from repositories. But yeah, if there's other questions or observations that you have around the work that we're doing within Gray, how it can be leveraged within your repository, or if you have comments or feedback on how we should move forward, let us know. We do have that open question about whether or not this is something of interest to the RDA community to create an interest group around. So we asked that in the Slido, but also if you have that interest, let us know. as a birds of a feather, we really just wanted to circulate this idea to the community, get people to understand where we're coming from, and see if there's other people interested in creating an RDA interest group around it. But regardless, if we do that, we just want to say thank you for everybody. And if you have any other feedback, please just find us and we can talk more.